Some of you know me as Phil, some of you know me as Kai. Tonight, I am Herr Dr. Professor Popp. I do actually have a PhD in comparative literature. I taught for 2 years at the University of Virginia and for 2 years at Towson University. And what I will be presenting to you tonight is the result of some research that I did when I was an academic into the history of utopian literature. This manifested in an article for the New York Review of Science Fiction on John Wyndham, who I will talk about shortly, as well as a conference paper at the Society for Utopian Studies in 2013. I also gave this talk at Baycon in 2014 and taught a class on zombie apocalypse and the utopian tradition for 6 weeks as part of the University of the Commons in San Francisco. So, that's where all this comes from, you were asking. Cool. All right, let's proceed. So, what I'm going to be presenting tonight is a structuralist analysis. Structuralism is most associated with Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist. I love this photo of him so much. This is from the 1930s. He actually died like 5 years ago, but I love his little pipe. All right. So, as a structuralist anthropologist, what Lévi-Strauss was interested in is the way in which cultures create units of meaning and use these within symbolic systems. So, that can extend to everything in the world. That can include things like foodways, that can include things like myths, which is what we'll talk about tonight. What he generally referred to as semiotics. So semiotics is the study of signs and sign systems. What kind of signs do cultures make, and how do they manipulate them? He is particularly interested in the study of myth, as stories and characters that cultures repeatedly use to make sense of the world. So, a myth for a structuralist anthropologist is something that's about a problem. A culture faces a problem. It's like, well, here's a problem that as a culture we want to think about. What is the nature of good? What is the nature of evil? We make up characters to play out in these stories. And we tend to repeat these characters and stories again and again, because the problems we're asking can't really be solved, right? So one of the ways in which you can tell that you're dealing with a kind of mythic structure is they use tropes. So a trope just means a literary device or figure. And when you see the repetition of a particular trope, it tells you something about the nature of that story. It tells you that it's probably connected to some kind of tradition, and that it is probably functioning as a kind of myth. So, why do we have so many stories about zombie apocalypse? Why do we have so many stories about zombie apocalypse?
It's entropy.
Yes, and it's a code word for the white supremacist movement for black people.
Branching off not quite from that, it is
Okay.
general a fancy idea people trying to escape.
Why do we have the repetition of the stories of zombies in our culture? We're fascinated with them.
I think it's a societal fear of its own death.
Well, sure, right?
We like the idea of an apocalypse where we can still kind of quote-unquote have fun because all the structural things are still there, but we don't have to actually go out and do any real work. We just have to kill things trying to kill us.
Maybe.
Tribalism of some sort.
Maybe, right?
It's a
I mean,
product.
certainly,
really cheap to make
certainly
those
you would have
zombie
to say
movies.
that at this point in time in the 21st century, I mean, just you can count on your fingers, right? The Walking Dead, 28 days later, 28 weeks later. You know, we go on and on.
An excuse to kill a bunch of guys without like having to worry about them actually being human, except that they are like human enough just to be threatening.
Yes, and in fact, I'll talk about that.
Damn it!
Apple wants
Every
to
time.
every time. Cancel that. That's fine.
Quick time.
I will actually
Nobody
not
uses
update this
QuickTime
time.
anymore.
It's time for quick time.
Okay,
It's never time for quick time.
so another example of myths, right? So for a structuralist, when you start talking about myth, the particular story doesn't matter. What you're interested in are the structural units. So for example, to a structuralist, Superman and the god Apollo are the same, right? They serve the same function, they have the same qualities, and we just keep resurfacing different versions of the same character. That kind of makes sense within our cultural context. Another interesting quality about myth, because they can't be exhausted, because the problem they're working with, or the idea they're working with, is so deep, they tend to grow upon themselves, right? So The way Levi-Strauss put it is that myths proceed spiral-wise in their elaboration. So you start from one point, you kind of go up to another and down a little bit. And then you put a little twist on that. And you keep kind of like making the myth go out as you try to explore different aspects of this. So one way you can think about this is Batman, right? An obvious mythic character in contemporary society. And we're really interested in Batman for some reason, and particularly his troubled aspect, right? And you think about how many different directors and how many different writers have gone in and taken that character and tried to elaborate on that myth and to bring it out in a spiralized fashion. So this happens all the time, right? This is going on all the time. This isn't stuff that just happens in primitive societies, right? We're doing this all the time. Again, think about the evolution of the zombie apocalypse, from George Romero to Danny Boyle to wherever you want to take it. They each take the myth, they do their little thing to it. They keep doing their little thing to it, right? So what's the nature of the thing that they do? That's the interesting part, right? So, speaking of utopian tropes, so how do you know when you're dealing with peaceful utopian literature? It has these things, right? So, let me ask you. I'm going to talk about 3 books and a movie. Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, published in 1888. News from Nowhere by William Morris, published in 1890. And John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids from 1951.
Oh, sweet.
What do these 3 books have in common with 28 Days Later?
Is perhaps
I
all of those
only
tropes?
read Day of the Triffids, but I mean, it involves basically mindless monsters roaming the streets.
Even simpler than that. Even simpler than that. What they all
Society
share.
falls apart.
No, even simpler than that.
It starts with somebody waking up.
Bingo. Classic utopian trope.
Mm.
How do you introduce people to the new world that you want to learn, that you want to teach them about? Well, there's 2 methods, right? They take a journey, which is what happens in Thomas More's Utopia, right? I journeyed to this far-off land, and let me tell you of the strange and mysterious things I saw there. The other method is someone falls asleep, and for some reason or other, wakes up in a new world, right? Classic utopian tropes. You have to get into the world. So how do you do that? Bingo. So what happens once you get there? The tour. What else is utopian literature about except the fucking tour, right? I land in this strange new world. I meet someone who shows me around. Oh, look at your interesting ways of doing things. Look how much better they are than ours, right? Inevitably, this also involves a shopping trip, right? Because within every utopian story, especially if it's a socialist one, you have to deal with the problem of, what about money? How do you exchange things? So every single utopian story you ever read will have a shopping part. In Bellamy, which is based on a centralized, nationalized distribution system, they go to a giant warehouse and just put in their order for whatever they want, right? Because there's no money. It's a complete communist society. You just take what you want.
Where was the shopping in Metropolis?
Well, arguably all of Metropolis is a shopping, right? But that's not really a utopian story. That's a dystopian story, which is a different deal. Yes, sir.
Is Bellamy the one where the guy falls asleep after being accidentally walled up in his house and wakes up in the weird future?
Pardon me?
Is Bellamy the one where the rich guy falls asleep in his
Yes,
little
that's getting ready.
Okay, now I think I think the same story.
So, and
I read that one.
in News from Nowhere, of course, they go to the market, right? Here in the anarchist syndicalist society, same thing. There's no money. And there's a whole section where our narrator walks into a shop and admires a pipe and says, "Oh, that's a very fine pipe. Might I see it, young man?" And the boy gives him the pipe, says, "Here you go, sir." And he's like, "Oh, how much is it?" "Oh, no, it's free. You can take it." Blah 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 blah. Right?
You're saying that zombie apocalypse is utopian, not dystopian?
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
So, what's the shopping trip in the zombie apocalypse?
The literal shopping trip where you
Finding all the free stuff you
guns.
need.
You walk up in any store, grab any
It's
gun
the
you
trip
want.
to the mall.
Precisely, right?
Okay.
You have to
Zombies
demonstrate
and
the
malls.
fact that money means nothing. We are
Let's
in
go to the
another
mall and get
economy.
everything we know
Money
we're able to
means
get in
nothing.
life.
Therefore, we have looting or we have the shopping trip, right? The explanation, right? How did this new world come about, right? How do we deal with that in zombie apocalypse?
The virus, the outbreak.
Rage-infected monkeys.
Often
Rage-infected monkeys, right? What's interesting about zombie apocalypse, though, as compared to other utopian stories, is zombie
It's always the
apocalypse
gimmick.
gets the explanation out of the way immediately. Disaster strikes. We're into the story. We'll figure out the rest later, right? Most utopian stories have very elaborate, very boring dialogues around this, but I'll get to that too. There always has to be a romance or a problem, right? Because you have to show, in the utopia, you have to demonstrate two other things. How do you deal with personal relationships? Because the new subjectivity is very important. How do people deal with things like passion and romance, right? In this new perfect world where everybody's more or less the same. And you have to have a problem. You have to introduce a crisis that has to be solved, right? To show how people can now function in this new world, right? So you have to have these. Everything, though, is aiming for these last 2 points. Every utopian story you will ever read is not about the system. It's about what the system produces, right? It's not about the economy. It's about the people who live in the economy. And that is, in fact, how we start with Thomas More's Utopia, the very first utopian novel, well, arguably, in Western literature, right? A bunch of guys who sit around a table. Thomas More, a bunch of royal guys. And one of the guys is like, why do we have so many fucking horse thieves in this country, right? Why do we have so many thieves in general? One guy says, well, obviously we're not killing enough people, right? We're not hanging enough, right? And More through his narrator says, well, maybe it's not that, maybe that's not the way we deal with it. Maybe the system is the problem. Maybe the system we've created is the problem. And we need to think about a different kind of system. Because if you have a different kind of system, you'll produce a different kind of person. So actually, Thomas More was the first psychoanalyst. So that's just a little side note. And that's in fact what utopia is about. Going to this other land, seeing how it works, and seeing what kind of people it produces. Right? That's everything that every utopian story aims for. What is the new subjectivity? And basically, how do we solve for X? We have too many horse thieves. How do we solve for X? Right? Every story, every future utopia is really about the present. Right? So
So what do you